Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutt of HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and discussion. It's wintertime, of course. No hurricanes to talk about, but we always like to look ahead and see what we might expect in the upcoming hurricane season by examining the bigger puzzle pieces that we can watch. So today's outlook for the 16th of January 2017. Happy Monday to you. Let's take a look at the abstract here from Phil Klotzbach and his team at Colorado State University in the Tropical Meteorology program. And they issued sort of an objective outlook, a qualitative discussion, as it were, for the upcoming 2017 hurricane season. And there are really two big players this far out in time that you can watch and see how those evolve over time that would ultimately have the most influence on the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season. The first is the strength of the AMO, or the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, which is a fancy way of saying that the Atlantic overall is warmer than it should be, and how that relates to what's called the thermohaline circulation, the salinity of the water, etc. It's very complex overall, but to break it down, is the Atlantic running colder or warmer than normal to meet the requirements of what we call a positive AMO here. And then, of course, I think the biggest driver, too, is the phase of the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon. Are we in an El Nino, which is an abnormal warming of the equatorial Pacific, or are we neutral, where things are pretty much balanced out, or is it La Nina conditions, where things are colder than normal? So let's examine just these two areas right here as we move through today's discussion, at least the first part of it. All right, so the Southern Oscillation Index is a measure of the pressure pattern across the tropical Pacific, and generally when it's substantially positive, that's a La Nina sign. Substantially negative is the opposite, and you get more of an El Nino signal. Well, the last 90 days it's been hovering pretty close to zero overall, which of course is around neutral, and that's pretty much where it's been in November and December. The last 30 days on the positive side overall at about 6.5, and then the contributor today, the pressure measurements between Tahiti and Darwin in Australia, gives us a negative 3.9. So it's really not moving either way, up or down, too strongly. Okay, so there's no overwhelming signal here. The 90-day is what I really like to track, and it's pretty close to zero. So we generally have neutral conditions. And if we look at the actual sea surface temperature anomalies, which those pressure patterns from the Southern Oscillation Index helps to shape, because when you have much lower pressure way over in the western Pacific, as it were, and higher pressure, draw that in red over here as an example, this is just a simplistic way to describe it. The air is going to move from higher pressure to lower pressure, and that's your general trade winds. That's fairly typical, and normally what you see. Well, when these winds are much stronger than they should be, you tend to get this La Nina pattern, and when those winds relax and maybe you have lower pressure in the eastern Pacific than you do in the western Pacific, that air becomes more westerly, high to low pressure, and you reverse all of this through here and start to warm it up. That's a very simple way to describe it. And so the pressure pattern we're seeing right now is, again, basically a level playing field. So as such, we're not seeing very cold conditions through here, still a little bit below average, and the eastern Pacific around the equatorial region has warmed up a little bit. We've lost some of those cold anomalies, but this is really interesting to me. It'll probably change over time, but when you see this pretty cold like this we're seeing today, if it were to hold on, as an example here, through the hurricane season, that would be really, really interesting, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Looking at the Atlantic, remember the other part of Dr. Klotzbach et al., their team, that they look at is the warm AMO. Well, generally speaking, the deep tropics here running a little bit warmer than they should be, especially the eastern third out here in the main development region. The northeast Atlantic still pretty much where it should be. Northwest Atlantic and the Gulf running quite a bit warmer than normal. But the AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, generally running just a little bit above the long-term average overall. No real signs of weakening. We don't see any giant cold areas out here in the northeast Atlantic. And even the far northern Atlantic up near Iceland and Greenland, not too bad overall. I probably should have put that graphic in. Maybe I can do that next week. More of a global shot than this Western Hemisphere shot. But, the AMO is basically hanging in there, all right? So it's not strongly negative, that's for sure. And we're really not seeing a very overwhelming signal here in the Pacific. If anything, slightly cooler, leaning a little bit more towards the colder ENSO phase than warm, okay? So now, I talked about this area right here. This is interesting. Like I said, it's cooled off. Some of these anomalies here are pretty cold. It's probably just a local effect of the way the weather pattern has been. Why is it interesting? Well, this is last year's almost peak of the hurricane season. This is August 25th, 2016. And look at that same area through here, much above normal overall, while we had the growing La Nina down near the equator. And this is where we had, hurricane after hurricane last year, just one after the other coming out of this region right down here. Luckily, the pressure pattern and the steering currents was such that they all pretty much turned away from Mexico, because there was a lot of them, one after the other. And so when you have colder than normal water in that same region, a lot of people like to refer to this as the Pacific Main Development Region, which is similar in the latitude area, roughly the same latitude as the Atlantic MDR. Well, when this is colder, you would typically have less activity in the eastern Pacific. But it's only January the 12th when this map was updated, and so we'll see. In fact, this should be updated again today. I'm surprised that it wasn't. Oh well, soon enough, right? Interesting to see, though, that that's there. We'll see how long it lasts. So let's move along here. Again, looking at the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon. Different ways to look at it. I've talked about this a lot. I love the different tools. This is a cross-section of the Pacific in the equatorial region, the temperature anomaly down below. All right, so we go from the surface at the top to 450 meters deep here at the bottom of the chart. And so up here in the top third and the eastern side of the Pacific, a few islands of colder than normal anomalies showing up. And then we have sort of this peninsula of warmer anomalies at depth, and then going very deep in the far western Pacific. So we'll see again how this evolves. None of this looks too alarming to me that there's a significant El Nino on the way, and until that changes, plus the pressure pattern from the Southern Oscillation Index not indicating any substantial westerly wind bursts, and what that means is we're not getting any drivers here in the western Pacific to really amplify this warm water and send it eastward, where it would get mixed in with the trades and start to surface and warm all of this through here. That's just not happening yet. It's still early. It could happen. And speaking of that, some of the models indicating that it might happen. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center International Research Institute different plot here, their probabilistic ENSO forecast, and this was updated in early January here. And we look through time, the rest of the winter into spring, general neutral conditions. I think logic dictates that that makes sense. But then when we get into the Atlantic hurricane season, the odds of El Nino begin to go up just a little bit. But the odds of La Nina go up less so, but they're still there. They're not going down. But this is interesting. We don't really crack the 40% probability yet. Even by August, September, and October here, it's only about 36%. Now, that's pretty far out in time and the very end of the prediction period here, and we know that the predictability barrier through the spring, it's just tough, right? And you just never know. Things could be drastically different. But, again, we like to say, okay, well, the future could be this, but what do things look like now that could shape the future? And until I see the Southern Oscillation Index heading negative and staying there, I'm not going to be concerned that we're going to have an El Nino at all, much less a strong El Nino. On the other hand, Dr. Klotzbach tweeted this out just recently, I think this morning. The European, what do they call it here? Is this their system? I can't remember. They have different versions of this. I was hoping it would say it in the graphic but it doesn't. That's okay. Anyway, the European, the ECMWF from the first day of January, and I think they have 51 members. I don't know. I have to research it to make sure I'm on top of exactly what I'm talking about. The bottom line here is you got all these ensemble members of the ECMWF. That's what each of these lines are through here. And roughly 70% of them, Dr. Klotzbach checked it out. That's his data, his work, not mine. He tweeted it, so I just want to give him credit. That roughly 70%, I didn't go in and count all these lines and come up with that number, believe me. 70% are calling for an El Nino, and some of the members suggesting a strong El Nino up here. I'm going to say this, the Euro has done this many times, and people who follow this know that. You go back to 2012 and 2014 as examples, and the Euro was really aggressive in trying to develop an El Nino, and typically you don't get another strong El Nino, if an El Nino at all, a year after you had one already. You know, we had a La Nina in between, as weak as it was. Nevertheless, well, there it is right there, System 4, glaring me in the face. I was trying to figure out the ECMWF System 4, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's what it shows. Let's keep an eye on this, okay? Let's look at this again in February, around mid-February, and let's see what this looks like then. I bet this will kind of stretch out even farther, and it'll start hedging its bets, put it that way. All right, so that's the different things. If we go back to the beginning real quick, the AMO still looks like it's, you know, generally positive, but not strongly so. Not yet. And that can change. It waxes and wanes. And the phase of the INSO. Okay, so both of these are still generally in question. Try to draw a question mark there. And we really don't have any clear answers this far out in time. So that's why we address this on a weekly basis. All right? So looking at lower 48 weather, Pacific Northwest staying very active, all kinds of weather still impacting that region. You may have heard about all the precip out here in the Intermountain West and the Sierra Nevada, etc. Great for the water issues out there overall, but boy, some of the reports out there of how much snow they had was just insane. Meanwhile, we have ridging generally over the east for the most part, especially the southeast, and so the storm systems are going up and around that ridge, and this is where your battle zone is in the cold area, and you have that overrunning moisture, and so we've had ice storm problems. We had severe weather down in this region last night, heavy rains in Dallas, just a mess because this ridge down here holding strong overall, and again keeps these weather systems shunted up and around that. Well, how will things change over the next little while? Well, first, this is basically what it looks like right now at the 500 millibar level. Here is eastern North America, the United States, as it were, Gulf of Mexico, etc., Mexico, the Baja, California, and up into Alaska, okay? And so here is our ridge right here, and here's our sort of trophiness carved out, bumping into that ridge, the ridge not giving way, and so here are our little pieces of energy that move around that ridge and bring stormy weather. And because it's winter and we are tapping into some of this cold air up here coming out of Canada, we've had this ice problem through here. So the southeast is protected. Parts of the Midwest have been plagued by this ice storm, and then some severe weather in between. Looking out here at 72 hours, day 3, still sort of stormy around the Texas Panhandle, and generally the southern plains, troughing, trying to come in back to the west again, and there's your ridge holding over the southeast United States. Going to still be very toasty down here in Florida. By day 5, pretty much the same. Anomalous ridging all the way up here into Canada, northeast Canada. That's incredible. And then you've got an extension of that, the southeast ridge, basically high pressure over the east, lower pressure over the west. So the cold is going to remain locked away for the time being. However, once we get out to day 7 and beyond, things might start to change. This is the GFS depiction. Pretty good cutoff low and trophiness coming into the deep south here a week from today. So this will be valid on the 23rd. And that could be the start of some changes coming in. We'll have to wait and see how it pans out. Indications from some of the long-range models and people who follow such things suggest that February is going to be quite different. Very stormy and very cold, probably for the east. We shall see, and that might be the beginnings of it there. All right, so stay tuned for that. We'll see what happens as we get towards next week. All right, so there you go. Pretty good detailed look at everything from the tropics to lower 48 weather. It's wintertime, so you're going to have ice storms, winter storms. And, my best advice for that, since it's pretty large scale right now, make sure you stay on top of it. If you know people that are traveling, by air or by land, and not so much by sea right now. Although the sea fog in some areas has been a problem as well. Just stay weather aware. We got so much going on. Just make sure you stay in touch with what's going on with the weather, not only affecting you now, but what might be coming in the next few days that could affect you. It's always a good idea, right? Okay, well, that is it from me for today. Thanks as always for tuning in. And don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, become a subscriber. It's free, right? So hit that subscribe button and you'll get updates every time I post a new video. And of course, once we get into hurricane season, I think they become more interesting, and they certainly can become more frequent, especially during Matthew. That was something else. For those of you that were around for that, you remember that. Have a great rest of your Monday afternoon. Again, thanks for tuning in. I do appreciate it as always. I'm Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, and I'll talk to you sometime next week.